Mr. Homi Ranivana, my friend, Mr. Raman Jokhakar, Justice Dr. Udvadia, and my dear friends, ladies and gentlemen. I think the contribution of Nani Palkhivala to independent India and to its democracy is as profound as it is indelible. He rose like an Adi Sankaracharya or a Napoleon, a prodigious talent and a hurricane of brilliant activity as soon as he joined the bar. He had a remarkable clarity of thought and the ability to assemble an argument of perfect symmetry and logic. The very simplicity of it had irresistible force. And when he argued, they said he mesmerized. And he embellished his presentation with anecdote, example, poetry, and prose because he was a polymath, so learned and steeped in literature, economics, philosophy, and spiritualism. I think the words he used for his own senior, Sir Jamshedji Kanga, are apposite for him. He said of Kanga, and I say of Palkhivala, that he had intellect enough to succeed without industry, and industry enough to succeed without intellect. I recall his personal kindness to me. When he gave me a reference for the Harvard Law School, it was short, precise, but obviously of immense weight. And he met me at Bombay House. He recounted my grandfather, with whom he had close relations, and their shared love of philosophy and the law. And he was above all a humble person. I think he shared that with Sir Jamshedji. Along with their genius, their humility and greatness was what marked them and set them apart. But I think he was much more than the greatest lawyer of independent India. Free enterprise was his abiding dream. You must remember that in the 60s and 70s, Indira Gandhi was at the peak of her powers. Socialist dogma ruled the day, urban land ceiling laws, the diminution and nationalism of private enterprise. This was the mood of the hour. And his was often a lone voice in the wilderness against all this populism. His only weapons were reason and persuasion. As a college student, I distinctly remember his budget speeches. They were masterpieces of entertainment, filled with examples, aphorisms, and pure economic common sense. And I truly believe it was Palkhivala's clarion call in the desert that was finally heeded by Dr. Manmohan Singh in 1991 when we had our economic revolution. And it was nothing short of an economic revolution. Palkhivala's unwavering belief was that only a free and unregulated economy could make India, a glorious and ancient civilization, rise from the ashes of colonialism and poverty. But his epiphany went beyond that. His unshakable credo was that the bedrock of a free economy was one and one alone, and that was a free society, governed by the rule of law and buttressed by respect for fundamental freedoms. That, after all, was also the credo of our freedom struggle, and it is engaged in our constitution, and in fact lies at the center of our flag, Ashoka the Great's Dharma Chakra, or 24-spoked wheel of law. But I believe that Nani Palkhivala today would have watched with dismay the breakdown of the rule of law globally. The rule of law, and not of men, is as important over nations as it is over a sovereign. What is the rule of law? In essence, it is the curtailment of sovereign power or the power of a nation and making it subservient to a law or a convention. Perhaps the most bizarre example from antiquity has to be from the book of Esther, something that the Bible called the laws of the Medes and the Persians. In other words, a Persian emperor, once he issued an edict, had no power to withdraw or revoke his own edict. And it has a bizarre manifestation in an incident once. The Emperor Xerxes was instigated by a conniving courtier, Haman, who told him that the Jews who are lying in camps in your capital are instigating a revolt. You have to put them down. So he issued an edict saying on so-and-so day, the Persian army will go into the Jewish camps and slaughter them. His favorite wife was a lady called Esther. Unbeknownst to Xerxes, she was actually a Jew. And when she heard about this, she revealed her true identity to him and said, you can't do this, you must revoke your edict. But there was the law of the Medes and the Persians. The convention or the rule of law forbade him to do that. So what did he do? He issued a second edict saying, yes, the Persian army will go into those camps, but they will be lightly armed, and the Jews will be armed. And that is the genesis of the third holiest festival of Judaism, the Purim festival, which is celebrated even today because the Jews won a famous victory over the Persians. The king's decree was supreme, therefore, even more supreme than the king himself. And the Jews took the benefit of that second edict, but clearly have recently not returned the favor. They remain better armed and better informed than their Persian opponents. All of you, of course, know the Magna Carta, which is the first manifestation in common law of the rule of law. When King John treated with his barons to be subject to certain laws, and he said no free man, a free man was of course a landowning gentry, no free man would be imprisoned or denied his liberties, save by lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. This supremacy of law, in this case the Constitution of India, was also the substratum of Palkhiwala's greatest contribution to India and the most important case in our constitutional history, the Kesavananda Bharati case, where he evolved the theory of implied limitations on the amending power of Parliament, on the sovereign legislative power. The issue was whether Parliament, with all its fulsome majorities, could amend our Constitution to eliminate even basic features of the Constitution without being accused of destroying it. He had nothing to go by way of precedent. He had just one prop, and that was a lecture given by a German professor from Heidelberg University called Dieter Conrad, who had given a lecture in 1965 at the Banaras Hindu University. An intern, Conrad, had drawn upon the theories of Carl Schmitt from the 1920s and 30s in Germany, and from the experience of Nazi Germany, where the Nazis annihilated the Weimar Constitution by perfectly legitimate and constitutional means. They used their majority to first ban the existence of other political parties, and then to transfer lawmaking from the Reichstag, the parliament, to the executive and to the German cabinet, and including transferring the power to make constitutional law. So they emasculated the parliament, and they thus destroyed democracy, completely following the letter of the law. Now, Palkhivala achieved exactly the opposite result in Kesavananda. By a razor-thin majority, 7-6, he got our Supreme Court to hold that certain basic features of our Constitution were inviolable and immutable, even against the power of a massive majority of the day in Parliament. And thus, Parliament's sovereign power, even in a democracy, was not supreme. The rule of law embodied in the Constitution was. And I believe it is no exaggeration, therefore, to describe Palkhivala as the savior of democracy in India. Now, a similar epiphany obsessed Woodrow Wilson at the end of World War I. He thought somehow that the sovereign and war-making powers of the nations of the world should be subject to the collective will of a family of nations. But his League of Nations was doomed to failure. The US itself did not join it, and in the 1930s, Japan walked out over Manchuria, Italy walked out over Abyssinia, and none of the other members had the spine to impose sanctions, much less to take up arms. The only thing that his League of Nations did was to germinate an idea and a dream in the mind of his young Assistant Secretary of the Navy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So when Roosevelt became president, first, of course, after the Great Depression and then going on to World War II, he had a dream. Might the powers of the victors of World War II be subjected to a collective rule of law of nations administered by the family of nations or the United Nations? And his dream was conceived, as you know, in June 1945 in San Francisco. Sadly, he didn't live to see the day because he passed away in Warm Springs, Georgia on the 11th of April, 1945. This was actually an astounding moment in history. Nothing like it had ever happened before. And how did this come about? For most of mankind's history, wars were the usual means of resolving conflicts between nations. An extension of politics by other means, said the great military strategist Clausewitz in the 19th century. In 1899 and 1907, you had some rudimentary conventions in the Hague Conventions, which banned the use of certain types of weapons like dum-dum bullets and gas balloons. And in 1907, required there to be at least a declaration of war before hostilities started. So you had this, that at the beginning of World War I, and even during it, it was not an international offense for Germany to invade neutral Belgium, for the Ottoman Empire to unleash the first modern genocide against the Armenians by ethnic cleansing, for German U-boats to stalk the Atlantic and sink even neutral ships, and for both sides to use deadly mustard gas against each other. None of these were international offenses or crimes. The Versailles Treaty, Article 227, provided that a special tribunal be formed consisting of representatives from the US, England, France, Italy, and Japan to try the Kaiser for the supreme offense against international morality and the sanctity of treaties. But which law prescribed this international morality and which law criminalized it? Holland refused to extradite the Kaiser, saying, we don't recognize these laws. There were no trials held even of the lower rungs of officers. Ultimately, a compromise was struck. The German Supreme Court in Leipzig was allowed to conduct a few trials. They were perfunctory. Most got acquitted. And those who were convicted ultimately were released on bail or just escaped. And the Turks were given an amnesty by the Treaty of Lausanne in 1924 in respect of the Armenian genocide. So it was really in 1928 when the Foreign Minister of France, Aristide Briand, and the Secretary of State of the US, Frank Kellogg, met, that they enunciated what has become known as the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which renounced war as a means of international dispute resolution. They decided that international disputes must be resolved by pacific means and not by resort to war. But even at that stage, though 44 countries signed up to that, war itself, aggressive war, was still not a crime. And there was this professor of international law in the Soviet Union, Professor Aaron Trenin, who lamented that hunting of rabbits internationally attracts more severe punishment than the launching of an aggressive war causing the military destruction of people. The 30s were an era of shifting alliances, much like today. There was a highly tariffed and isolationist America, much to the anguish of its internationalist president, President Roosevelt. And there were treaties and alliances made with different combinations. The only constant was that the upper crust politicians of England refused to deal with the Bolsheviks in Russia, who they distrusted traditionally. So ultimately, England had to enter into a treaty first with Germany in 1935, condoning the breaches of the Versailles Treaty, And then, of course, as you know, in 1938, Chamberlain, their prime minister, made 3 trips to Munich to ultimately be able to wave that piece of paper saying, peace for our time. Hitler used that to take over the Sudetenland, which was the subject matter of the treaty. And then, of course, within a few months in March 38, went even further, March 39, sorry, went further and seized the whole of Czechoslovakia. He was not the only one. A little known fact is even Poland, who later was his victim, seized a little coveted part of Czechoslovakia because there were no rules, there was no respect for sovereignty. Hitler used to call the leaders. Chancellor Schuschnigg of Austria was summoned to his house, the Berghof at Berchtesgaden, for talks. But ultimately all that happened is Hitler and his team ganged up on him. There was threats, there were insults, and there was bullying. And he succumbed. A few months later, the president of Czechoslovakia was called, Emil Hácha. Much the same thing happened. He was threatened with the carpet bombing of Prague. He succumbed. In fact, he suffered a heart attack during the ordeal. Now, it was only in May 1939 when Chamberlain made that unsolicited guarantee of protection to Poland that the alliances swiftly recalibrated. Stalin reached out to Hitler and proposed a meeting. And in August 1939, the Nazi-Soviet pact was entered into. But there was a secret protocol that accompanied it, which provided for the carving up of Poland between them and the allocation of spheres of influence. Now, using that, Germany, of course, invaded Poland. 2 weeks later, the Soviet Union invaded Poland. The Soviet Union went on to attack Finland, Bessarabia, a small part of Romania, and the 3 Baltic states, and took them over. 6 sovereign entities. Germany ultimately ended up by invading 5 sovereign entities. Numbers don't matter, but I'm just mentioning this. Poland, Belgium, Holland, France, and of course, earlier Czechoslovakia. But surprisingly, the Western powers never declared war on the Soviet Union, even when it invaded Poland. They only declared war on Germany, and that Nazi-Soviet alliance, well, fell apart on the early morning hours of the 22nd of June, 1941. So much for alliances made out of expediency and not under the rule of law. Now, what happened after the invasion of the Soviet Union was the most barbaric events that mankind has known. First, the Einsatzgruppen were sent in, and with the assistance of some Poles and Ukrainians, there was mass murder and massacre of the Jews by machine gunning and other ways. This, of course, progressed after the Wannsee Conference to the gas chambers. Now, the West had heard of this. Word had reached the West, but they did nothing. But in 1942, the US and UK proposed what they called a United Nations Commission for War Crimes. First time the term was used. And India, by the way, was a member of that commission even in 1944, pre-independence. Now, we move forward to this famous scene in the Tehran conference, where the big 3 met in 1943. Over dinner, much vodka flowed, and the talk turned to what do we do with the Nazis and the leadership of Germany after we win the war. Stalin said, very easy. We'll just round up the top 50,000 or 1 lakh officers and shoot them. Churchill was horrified. He walked out of the meeting. One doesn't know whether Stalin was pulling his leg or it was serious, but no one could afford to take Stalin lightly because remember, during the Great Terror, he had done exactly that to his own general staff. He had eliminated 3 out of 5 field marshals, 500 generals, 1,000 majors, 40,000 other officers had all been liquidated. So that was the state of affairs in 1943. But by 1944, Churchill's little tantrum became famous last words because Lord Simon, his chancellor, actually proposed in a memo that they should do exactly that, execute the Nazi leadership without trial. And at the Quebec conference in September 44, between Churchill and Roosevelt, he got Churchill to sign a document agreeing to that. And Churchill, of course, was encouraged by his Secretary of the Treasury, Henry Morgenthau, who also believed no trials, we must execute without trial. Now, this is the surprising turn. In October 44, Churchill flew to Moscow to parley with Stalin, which he used to do quite regularly. Stalin suddenly did a volte-face and he insisted, he said, no, we must have a trial. Of course, he was thinking of a show trial, where you would extract confessions from the accused, not by the force of evidence against them, but by the pain of torture. But he said, we must have a trial, and he actually started reassembling the A-team that he had got in the Great Terror. So he put up a secret commission headed by Andrei Wyszynski, who was his chief prosecutor between 1936 and 1938 at all the show trials. Now, when this happened, Churchill withdrew the Simon Memo, and by January 1945, even Roosevelt came around to the idea that you must have a trial. But there was a strong lobby even in the US that wanted to avoid a trial. There was a young New York lawyer by the name of Murray Bernays, and he proposed that to do that would make a mockery, that is, to execute without trial, would make a mockery of the very ideals for which the Allies had gone to war in the first place. And he had read the work of the Soviet scholar Trenin, and he proposed the fact that even the conspiracy or planning of war was an international crime, and there could even be guilt by association with certain criminal organizations like the Nazi Party and the SS. He found a supporter in Henry Stimson, the US Secretary of War, who felt that execution without a trial ran the risk of turning the Nazi leadership into martyrs. And he said only a trial would receive the respect of history. April 1945 was a turning point, because just after Roosevelt died, his successor Truman emphatically weighed in for a full judicial trial. And his second masterstroke was he asked Justice Robert Jackson, a sitting judge of the US Supreme Court, to take temporary leave from the US Supreme Court and become the US chief prosecutor and to head the entire team to prepare for this trial. Now loomed large the question of how to charge and convict Nazi leadership for actions that may not have been crimes under international law when they were committed. In other words, could you have what we lawyers call an ex post facto law? And would that work as far as criminal convictions were concerned? They met in London between June and August. The Soviet representatives, of course, took the guilt of the war criminals as proven, and they considered the trial to be a mere propaganda exercise. But Jackson and the Attorney General in Churchill's cabinet, David Maxwell Fyfe, a Scotsman, said no. If you're going to have a trial, it must be a proper trial with a full presumption of innocence and a right to a full defense for the accused. There was, however, a substantial impediment. The very first charge which was being talked about was the crime of launching an aggressive war. Now, that would have implicated the Soviets as well. Because remember, there were unprovoked attacks by the Soviet Union on Finland, on Poland, on Bessarabia, and on the Baltic states. And the complicity of the Soviets in the German invasion of Poland was also established by their pact with the Germans and the secret protocol that they had signed. Of course, even the Allies, France and England, had signed Munich, which allowed Hitler to swallow Czechoslovakia. And then there was a third smoking gun, which is the massacre in the Katyn forest outside Smolensk of some 11,000 Polish officers. Now, at that time, it's possible that the representatives who met in London, including the Soviet reps, did not actually know that this was something that had been done by the Soviet Union itself and not by the Germans. The talks reached an impasse because Jackson and Maxwell Fyfe said, we cannot tailor the crime to the accused. A crime is a crime regardless of who committed it. But at the Potsdam conference, it was felt that a compromise must be reached because the Cold War was already in its early days. And Stalin, too, was very anxious to have a compromise because he wanted to showcase to the whole world the immense suffering, death, and destruction that Germany had inflicted on the Soviet Union. So a compromise was reached in the form of Article 6, which restricted the jurisdiction to of the International Tribunal only qua persons belonging to the Axis European countries. That excluded everyone else, including the Soviets. And 3 crimes broadly were evolved. Crimes against peace, that is the planning, initiation, preparation, and launch of an aggressive war. This was Dr. Aaron Trenon's really thought process. He himself was a student of Wyszynski, and he had evolved this theory strangely enough in connection with Stalin's show trials, where the linchpin of the charge was crimes against the state, that is the conspiracy or complicity to defeat the Bolshevik revolutionary order. He adapted that to international law. The second main charge was crimes during the war, that is war crimes. So against person or property, wanton destruction, murder, etc., which was not necessary to achieve military objectives. The third was crimes against humanity, that is all types of acts, murder, enslavement, extermination, any type of inhuman act against any person on grounds of race, religion, or community, whether or not it was a crime in the country in which it was committed. The last was very important because much of the extermination was legitimized and not a crime under German law. And this crimes against humanity bundle was the thought process of Professor Hersch Lauterpacht, a Polish Jew who taught at Cambridge. Ultimately, the first in charge of crimes against the peace was broken up into conspiracy and pure crimes against the peace. Now, one other important thing. The London Charter excluded the defense of respondeat superior, which is really a plea that what could I do? I had an order from my superior, I had to carry it out. And that became known as the Führer defense during the Nuremberg trial. That was excluded as a defense, but Article 8 allowed its use in mitigation for the purpose of punishment. Genocide was included in the indictment at the instance of another Polish Jew, Professor Raphael Lemkin, who argued it was different from crimes against humanity. Geno, the Greek word genos, mean an entire race or tribe, with side, the Latin word for kill, genocide. But ultimately, genocide actually didn't form the basis of the final judgment at Nuremberg. Now, the trial opened in courtroom number 600 at the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, amongst the only buildings standing and which had survived Allied bombing, which had flattened the rest of Nuremberg. And the strange part was, right up on top in the courtroom was a plaque of Moses' 10 commandments, which was cheekily looking down at the spectacle that was unfolding below. And of course, that plaque had been covered during the Nazi era. The American judge chosen was someone called Francis Biddle. Biddle had taken the place of Jackson when Jackson was first Solicitor General, then Attorney General, then Supreme Court Judge. Biddle succeeded him to the Solicitor Generalship and the Attorney Generalship. But the two had a strained relationship. And Jackson was not happy, but he had to lump it. Now, Jackson's opening speech was a spectacular one. It's perhaps one of the greatest openings in the history of trials ever. He did not want this to be merely a trial for war criminals. What he wanted was a verdict of civilization on barbarity. He wanted to set the rules to prevent such wars in the future, and he wanted the trial to demonstrate America's moral leadership in the world. He advanced 5 major theses. First, he said, the foundation of all international law necessarily has to be morality. The second was that the very idea that states committed crimes was a fiction. Crimes are always committed by individuals. Third, that although Germany alone was not responsible for the massive destruction caused by World War II, the difference was that it visited destruction as a matter of planning, purpose, and policy. 4, it could not be left to the defeated to judge themselves, a cause that had failed in World War I. The victors must judge the vanquished, but with the full trial, in a full trial with all safeguards. And 5, the presumption of innocence was absolutely pivotal. The accused and defense must have it. And that last principle has a resonance today, because we have several laws that seek to reverse this presumption in cases of terrorism. But it's illuminating to remember that the greatest trial in history, of arguably the greatest terrorists in history of all time, was built on the solid bedrock of a presumption of innocence under criminal law. He argued that Hitler, by first subduing, persecuting and terrorizing his own population, had left himself free to then turn against the rest of Europe. He called it experiments in aggression. Now, as part of their evidence, both the US and Soviet prosecution teams showed graphic films of the death camps, piles of dead bodies, emaciated bodies, skeletons, ovens, gas chambers, and the court was utterly shell-shocked. And they shone a very strong light on the dock to bring out and emphasize the reactions of the accused. And the accused turned away, put their heads in their hands, some wept, but it had its impact. And one of them, Hans Frisch, went back to his cell and told the psychologist, "No power in heaven or earth will erase this shame from my country." Now, as I'm sure you all know, Hermann Göring, was the second highest ranking Nazi. And during his prime, he was corpulent, he was a morphine addict, and he was actually bejeweled and rather liked putting on makeup. But he was a cunning and engaging personality as well. By the time he took the stand, he had been forcibly weaned off his drugs, he had lost masses of weight, and had regained his sharpness and wit. He had accepted his fate and was now gunning for a place in history as a fallen hero. So what did he do? He took full responsibility for all his orders, and many of them were dubious. For example, the Nuremberg racial intermarriage laws, the looting of occupied nations, etc. He accepted the initial setting up of concentration camps. In fact, he slyly looked at the Soviet judges and said, "We copied this idea from abroad." Thirdly, he claimed ignorance of the death camps. He said Himmler did all of that, entirely responsible. Fourthly, he denied responsibility for the burning of the Reichstag, which of course subsequently has been proved to be false. For the Rome affair, Night of Long Knives, and for the looting of art, he said, "I was only caretaking these paintings and works of art. I was going to pay for them." His evidence in chief alone took 12 hours. He displayed a brilliant mastery over the facts, and he almost rallied the accused behind him. Then came the turning point of the trial, his cross-examination by Jackson. And interestingly, that cross-examination commenced almost exactly 80 years to this day, because it started on the 18th of March, 1946. Now, Jackson's cross-examination was not focused. He allowed Göring to parry the question, to give long speeches, to poke jibes at the Allies. Göring was in tremendous form, and he knew it. And Jackson lost his composure. He appealed to the bench to restrict Göring and limit him to the yes-no answers which American courtrooms were familiar with. But the judges confabulated. Jackson's old nemesis, Francis Biddle, whispered with Sir Geoffrey Lawrence, the English president of the tribunal, and they rejected Jackson's objection and let Göring continue. And Jackson was quite shattered by this. It said he never recovered during his cross from that first day. But instead of moving on, Jackson made complaint after complaint. He got foot-faulted on a translation area. He showed Göring a document which should have read cleaning of the Rhine. The wrong translation said liberation of the Rhine, which Jackson understood to mean liberation of the Rhineland. That is the 1946 Act. And Göring absolutely pummeled him, saying that there was no law that prevented making the Rhine more navigable, even if it was a preparation for war. And there was nothing wrong in it being secret. And Göring sarcastically added, "I don't recall reading in advance the US's plans for mobilization before the war." But then Jackson recovered. He slowly confronted Göring with evidence on the Kristallnacht, the infamous night of shattered glass. And he then confronted him with his own statements where he was shown to be a vulgar and vicious Jew-baiting Nazi. And finally, the polished Goering was unmasked. Maxwell Fyfe went even further. He adopted a traditional English style of cross-examination. No confrontation with the witness, pointed leading questions, carefully chosen confronting material. And he caught Goering in a web. And finally, Goering broke down on two issues. One is the murder of some 50 British airmen at the Stalag Luft camp. And the second was the use of slave labor in the 4-year plan which had been prepared and finalized by Goering himself. Now, what was important was each of the defendants got a full opportunity of defense. For example, it's interesting, Admiral Dönitz was allowed to address an interrogatory or a query to Admiral Chester Nimitz of the US on the rules of naval warfare. Because one of the charges against Dönitz was that his U-boats would attack by stealth and surprise, no warning. They would shoot to kill or torpedo to kill. And when there were survivors, often they would not rescue the survivors but leave them to drown in the oceans. And Dönitz was able to prove that these were standard rules of naval warfare through his interrogatory to Admiral Nimitz. In his closing arguments, Jackson underscored the difference between civilization and power. And he said that at the height of the pomp and power of these accused, they had never given a trial which now the victorious allies were giving them. Sir Hartley Shawcross, who closed arguments for England, made 4 very powerful points. The first, he said, is that the Charter only created the machinery for trying crimes which had already existed as part of national laws, murder, enslavement, etc. 2, by attacking nations without a declaration of war, the action was illegal and the killing of combatants amounted to murder. 3, states may be great and powerful, but ultimately the rights of the individual men are fundamental. And 4, he did not exonerate the German people for slavishly and mindlessly submitting to a leader, quote, who appeals to their lowest instincts, who confirms them in their vices, and teaches them to conceive nationalism as isolation and brutality. Now, most of the charges stuck during the judgment. The overarching charge of conspiracy failed, but the tribunal found smaller conspiracies, which ultimately led to the war. Crimes against peace was upheld because there was a violation of the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And of course, the easiest was war crimes and crimes against humanity, because the evidence was overwhelming and most was documentary, because the meticulous Germans had documented each and every victim in voluminous registers. This was therefore not murder by stealth. It was on a grand scale, proudly testamented for history. Some death camp commandants had bragged about meeting their targets as if they were talking about corporate sales figures. The Achilles heel of Nuremberg remains Article 6. It remains the foundational moral question. And in 2 ways, Article 6 suppressed some horrific crimes. First, the massacre at Katyn, as I told you, where these mass graves were dug up by the Germans in 1941 as they were advancing, and Goebbels used it as a huge propaganda coup. But in 1943, when the Soviets regained that territory, they actually dug up the graves, and we now know, planted evidence amongst the remaining bodies, produced a Pliant Commission report called the Burdenko report, and even ran a luxury train tour of foreign correspondents to interview coached witnesses and see the site. From the evidence discovered after 1991, we now know that the Germans were right. It was Stalin and Beria who had liquidated the entire top brass of the Polish army and had hidden their remains in the pits at Katyn. Now, just before the defense was to lead evidence, something dramatic happened. The evidence started, as I said, of the defense on the 18th of March, 1946. A few days before, on the 5th of March, Winston Churchill, who was by then no longer Prime Minister, had made his famous Iron Curtain speech at Fulton in Missouri in the US, where he said an iron curtain from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has fallen over Europe. And that changed the cooperation between the prosecutorial teams. So suddenly the unwritten pact to keep out awkward evidence collapsed, and even the approach of the Western judges changed. And the court permitted to allow evidence of a secret protocol of 1939 between Germany and the Soviet Union, although it ruled out evidence of the Munich Agreement as irrelevant. Rudolf Hess's lawyer produced an affidavit from one Friedrich Gauss, who had accompanied Ribbentrop to Moscow and had actually drafted the secret protocol. And finally, even Ribbentrop himself testified to the secret protocol by which the Germans and the Soviets had drawn a line and had demarcated spheres of influence in Europe. Of course, he said our invasion of the Soviet Union was a preventive war because the Soviets had breached the secret protocol. They were allowed only to invade Bessarabia, a part of Romania, but not Bukovina, which they also then invaded. And therefore, they had breached the protocol. Both Caton and the secret protocol placed a moral question at the forefront. Was an identical action not a crime only because it was committed by one of the allies? Because without Article 6, the prosecution might well have been the accused. However, and unfortunately, neither Caton nor the secret protocol find any mention in the judgment. But the shadow of Article 6, to my mind, has been cast over the world ever since, because no victor in a war has ever been called to trial for crimes against peace or for war crimes. The Nuremberg trial established the rule of law over nations themselves. But Professor Trenin's lament about resort to war not actually being a crime remained unheeded. It remained unheeded for 50 years. It was only in the year 2002 that an international criminal court was established at The Hague, which expressly made genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and crimes of aggression as international crimes. Of course, Article 12 of it made this prospective. But the US, Russia, China, India, and Israel are not members of that International Criminal Court. So was Nuremberg victor's justice? Of course it was. Was it justice? The answer must equally emphatically be yes. A full defense, a presumption of innocence, representation by former Nazis as defense lawyers, rights of cross-examination and discovery. It was one of the most remarkable tributes that civilization could ever have given to the rule of law. And that is probably why Hitler, Himmler, and Goebbels had committed suicide, because they did not wish to face the possibility of the dread sentence that you will be weighed in the balance by the judgment of the law and punished. And the best rationale, to my mind, for the trial was given by Jackson himself in a magnificent tribute in his opening argument, where he said that 4 great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stayed the hand of vengeance to give their captive enemies a trial by the judgment of the law. And that is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason. I don't think you can put it better than this. It explains why we gave a terrorist Ajmal Kasab a trial. It's the best answer. Because if you don't give a trial, then you are reducing civilized society to the same level of the accused. And today, Germany and Japan are proud, prosperous, and peace-loving countries. They've confronted their past. They do not deny it. They teach it in their schools. And the result is there for all to see. Now, history tells us that one of the primary reasons for war is domination, economic or political. I believe that underlying the decimation of Gaza today and its peoples by bombing and starvation is the same imperative to dominate. Now, similar imperatives to dominate motivated the devastation of Thebes and the setting ablaze of Persepolis by Alexander of Macedonia, the destruction of Carthage by Rome, the sacking of Vijayanagar by the Deccan Sultanate, the massacre at Lucknow in 1858 by the East India Company, and the obliteration of the Warsaw Ghetto in 1944 by the Germans. And in its muteness, the world stands condemned as complicit. One can only recall the words of the last of the Antonine emperors, the great philosopher king Marcus Aurelius, when he said, "Often injustice lies in what you are not doing, not only in what you are doing." Perhaps the only exception in history was Cyrus the Great, who, when he conquered Babylon through his Cyrus cylinder, actually announced to the conquered subjects that you could keep your property, keep your religion, and most important, keep your slaves. I am not here to take any of this away. And he freed the Jews from their captivity and promised to rebuild King Solomon's temple from Persian coffers. That was not regime change in the sense that we today understand it. That was allowing people to continue with their lives as they were even before the conquest. Perhaps the most egregious breaches of sovereignty today is what we lightly call regime change. The first example of this was the Kaiser during World War I. As you know, of course, the Russian Revolution, which deposed the Tsar, was in February 1917. And it brought a Duma-led government, a provisional government, to control Russia. Now, the Kaiser thought once this government comes in, they will immediately capitulate, and my Eastern Front will have peace, and I will then be able to concentrate on the Western Front. Not so, because Kerensky, who led the provisional government, immediately started planning a new military campaign against the Germans. Now, because of this, in March 1917, the Kaiser used his secret weapon. He transported Lenin and a group of revolutionaries who were in Switzerland across war-torn Europe in a train provided by the Kaiser so that Lenin could make his grand entry at the Finland station on 3rd of April 1917. And there is today, though much of the documentation on this has been destroyed, there is today some evidence of a money trail and perhaps the funding of the Bolsheviks by the Kaiser, and the figures are staggering, $1 billion in today's money. And that perhaps permitted the Bolsheviks to arm themselves and stage their coup, which was the October Revolution, where they deposed the provisional government. That regime change, of course, did not pay, because less than 30 years after that, the same Bolshevik Red Army had its booths in Berlin. Regime change rarely pays. Look at Afghanistan. Started with the king getting deposed in 1973, and in 79 you had the Soviet invasion, which brought in a communist government. That was then met after a few years of the Afghan war, which was supported by Pakistan and the US, to the Taliban regime. But then the Taliban regime was deposed by external help to the Northern Alliance. And then when the US left, the Northern Alliance was deposed and the Taliban are back. So where has all this regime change got anybody? Only expenditure of billions of dollars. Same with Iraq. Same with much of Latin America. Iran itself is a classic example. General Reza Shah seized power in 1925, deposing the last Qajar dynasty monarch. He was actually a reformist king. But one thing he did was give very cheap concessions of oil to the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. Now in 1941, when the Soviet Union was attacked by the Germans, Iran became a critical supply line to the Soviet Union for the massive economic and military aid given by America. And at that time, Reza Shah started displaying pro-Nazi tendencies. So promptly in September 1941, they deposed him and put his 21-year-old son on the throne, Shah Muhammad Reza Pahlavi. In 1953, when a populist socialist government under Mohammad Mossadegh swept to power in Iran and nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Company, the CIA, it is rumored, led a coup to depose Mossadegh, re-establish the Shah's rule. He had fled to Italy. And the Shah, of course, promptly gave back the concessions to the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and denationalized it. Now this, therefore, is the regime change. The latest regime change in Iran is hardly the regime change that anyone would have wanted, because his son has succeeded his father as the supreme leader. So much for constitutional democracy and so much for the rule of law. Now, the UN Charter prohibits interference with sovereignty, independence, and integrity. It bans the threat to use force and the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. It mandates that peaceful means must be used as a means of dispute resolution in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered. It declares the ends or the purposes of the Charter, and that those include justice and respect for the obligations arising out of international law. And it enunciates the means for achieving those ends, which include to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors. Now, juxtapose these very lofty objectives and principles with at least 5 recent events. 1, the full-scale invasion of the Ukraine by Russia in 2022. 2, Iran's proxy terrorism through Hezbollah and Hamas, including on 7th October 2023. And the Pakistan state-sponsored terrorism, including in Mumbai and Palkhivala, because terrorism itself is a crime against humanity. 3, the kidnapping of a head of state of Venezuela. 4, the bombing and obliteration in June 2025 of Iranian nuclear facilities at Fordow and Natanz. 5, the liquidation of Ayatollah Khamenei and the entire top military leadership of Iran, which happened only 2 weeks ago. These actions were by drones, missiles, and arms, not by the judgment of the law. And the UN Charter, in my respectful opinion, was violated by these actions. These operations against Iran were as audacious as they were unwise, as powerful as they were illegitimate. Make no mistake, Hezbollah and Hamas are terrorist organizations. And the leadership in Iran is highly repressive, has wrought havoc and misery in its region. Thousands of protesting Iranians were brutally murdered by this regime earlier this year. And Iran is accused of perpetrating and financing terrorism and has itself treated the UN Charter with scant regard. But after the initial attacks, both joy and sorrow spilled over onto the streets of Iran. And large sections of Iranians, burdened by a vicious and tyrannical regime, celebrate what they see as liberation. But as Gandhiji said, an eye for an eye will only make the whole world blind. Instead of witnessing a trial like Nuremberg, establishing the guilt of each target, and giving some redemption to the families of their victims, these unilateral strikes now run the risk of turning the targets into martyrs. And the rest of the world looks upon in shock and disbelief as the UN Charter, so painstakingly crafted by the had paid to reason. But now the question that must hang most heavily in the air is reason paying tribute to power? The world is fracturing into new alliances and groupings, all predicated on an isolationist and tariffed US, much like the 1930s. I chanced upon a State of the Union address by Roosevelt in January 1937. It is uncanny because it holds a mirror to 2026. I'm going to quote just 2 bits out of it. He warned that America must take, quote, cognizance of growing ill will, of marked trends towards aggression, of increasing armaments, of shortening tempers, a situation which has in it many of the elements that lead to the tragedy of general war. And then he forged a path forward and said, but if face it we must, then the United States and the rest of the Americas can play but one role, through a well-ordered neutrality to do not to encourage the contest, through adequate defense to save ourselves from embroilment and attack, and through example and all legitimate encouragement and assistance to persuade other nations to return to the ways of peace and goodwill. These are prophetic words. They apply as much today as they applied in 1937. But I ask myself, who will assume the mantle, the great mantle of Roosevelt in today's world? Powerful leaders who are wise efface their power for the greater good to become great statesmen. Not so in the jungle. There the mightiest rule, and the arrogance of power is supreme. Most importantly, as Jackson said in his argument at Nuremberg, civilization does not expect that you can make war impossible. It does expect that your juridical action will put the forces of international law on the side of peace. So those heralding the demise of international law have nothing to offer us but an endless cycle of violence. Because war anywhere affects peace and well-being of humanity everywhere. Take the closing of the Straits of Hormuz. That is going to devastate economies all over the world. And to borrow a phrase from Dr. Ambedkar, albeit in a different context, the world today has dissolved into the grammar of anarchy. Scorned and disparaged, the UN matrix still remains the best answer and a better answer than the fortresses of nations we are seeing emerge. It's desperately in need of reform. The Security Council's permanent membership must include India, Japan, Brazil, and the African Union, but the rest of the world can unite under the best banner of them all, the rule of law of nations. And the prodigals will return, because nothing is established more clearly by history than the fact that interlocked economies, free trade, and global institutions, all governed by rules, are the best answers yet to conflicts between nations. There are wars ahead, but these are of a different kind, and they will confront our species. Climate change, uncontrolled AI, and scarcity of water. These enemies will run riot through a fractured and lawless humanity. They will themselves cause further conflicts. They cry out for global unity and for a rules-based order. So we must turn, as we often do, to ancient wisdom. The Maha Upanishad gifted humanity with the concept of the Atman Brahman, the ultimate reality. And that was Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the full quotation being, for those of noble character, the entire world is one family. It is a philosophical and holistic concept of universal kinship. It refers not merely to humanity, but also to nature and to the oneness of the cosmos and the spirit. It promotes a view of harmony with the elements, responsibilities towards all forms of life, to animals and to nature, and it sets its face against hatred and violence. It promotes responsible stewardship of the earth. Only this philosophy, I believe, practiced not just at a global, but also at a social and individual level, can save humanity. In many ways, Nani Palkhivala had a vision of the future, echoing Sri Aurobindo's prophecy of a world state. And Palkhiwala's words were prophetic. He said, "The exhortation to divert resources from weaponry to development stands no practical chance of being heeded unless and until the balance of terror is replaced by the balance of reason." For as long as Palkhivala has remembered, his quest for a free society, buttressed by the rule of law, and above all, for the balance of reason, will fuel the flame that will burn in the human species. The industrial and technological revolutions, I put to you, dazzled humankind with immense power, but they did not give us the wisdom to harness that power with judgment and temperance. The rule of law matters because that is the only order based on reason. And it is reason, not power, that defines our species. Thank you.